have some questions from last week that were interesting that I thought I would read and discuss a little bit. Here's one. So I wrote a book, which I thought was going to be an orphaned book. And it's called Unmasking Your True Self. And the subtitle is The Lone Ranger and Tonto Meet the Buddha. If you get the picture that it might have been a hard sell, you're right. It's been orphaned for 2 years, but it's just been bought by a publisher. And one of the subjects that it touches is addressed in this question. So last week you spoke about American Zen and how the gift wrapping of different cultures may be different, but the gift, the Dharma, is always the same. My former Japanese teacher called this, quote, holding the lotus to the rock, and said that it could take up to 400 years for the transmission of Zen from east to west to be complete. On the other hand, I have American friends who are Zen teachers and have eliminated anything Japanese from their practice and their Zendo, robes, chanting, etc. I suspect there's a middle way. What's your take on this? Well, I'm the middle way. So, Buddhism as we know it, as it's expressed to us, as it came from India, we call Vipassana, and traveled to China. It's called, our lineage, Zen lineage, called Chan. Dogen came, he brought it back to Japan, created Zen, which is basically strong on sitting, strong on fundamental insight, short on ideas, and long, complicated explanations. And in every country, in China, Buddhism merged with Taoism and Confucianism. And in Japan, it merged with Shintoism, the native nature religion. And in Tibet, it merged with Bon shamanism. And you get all that wiggy masks and demons and the elaborations of Tibetan Buddhism. And it's different in Thailand, it's different in Indonesia. But the gift, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, compassion, kindness, mutual dependence, or interdependence, that's all the same. So what's interested me as my practice has developed, and I was trained in a really strict Japanese monastic tradition. Suzuki Roshi came to America and he taught what he knew. And he recreated Japanese monastic tradition. And it's very powerful and it's very good. Especially because there's so much about it that doesn't make sense at all to Americans, that feels like it's impinging our freedom. Hey man, I came here to get enlightened and, I got to clean the toilet. I got to keep my mouth shut. But after a number of years, I began to suspect, and obviously I'm not alone in this, as the question says, that there was a certain amount of slavish imitation of Japanese culture. And sometimes I felt that it diluted the true gift of the Buddha. With Japanese culture, you got a lot of hierarchy. You got a lot of authoritarianism. The guru is the boss. Everyone under him or her listens, does what they're told, hop to. And I thought that played to some of the elements of American culture that were most problematic. So for instance, in Japan, if you go to a training monastery, you live maybe 2 years, 3 years training in this monastery. And then you go out to a temple and you're a priest. And it's a hard scrabble life. You're taking care of parishioners. You're performing ceremonies and services and blessing babies and burying people. But in America, there are no temples to graduate to. So one of the problems that I perceived at Zen Center, which is my kind of where I got my training, was that priests would graduate and they would get transmitted, they would get their brown robes, but they would have no place to go. So they would stay at Zen Center, they'd get a job. And at a certain point, it began to remind me of acting students who loved acting school. And they just decided to hang around school and the teacher. And I thought, well, you know, you're not an actor till you get a job. And you're not a priest until you're taking care of people. So in my book, there's a quote in the frontispiece by Yasutani Roshi or Yamato Roshi. I forget, to be honest. And he says, you know, we expect that you'll discover an American voice to Zen. But first it has to be discovered by someone who's seen, you know, whose eyebrows have tangled with the Buddha's eyebrows, who sees the teaching as it's intended to be taught. And that's one of the things I liked about Zen practice, is this notion of transmission, that you work with a teacher until he or she decides that you're fully baked and you're ready to go. And, you know, nothing prohibits failure, nothing prohibits mistakes. But in a way, it's an antidote to people just hanging up their own shingle. Shaman, healer, teacher. It's wiggy, it's a title, it's high status. I mean, everybody listens to you, for a while anyway. So I began to wonder what it would be like for Americans to speak to Americans who were not going to shave their heads. They were probably not going to wear robes. They were probably not going to go through a monastic training. But it seemed to me that that was no reason for them not to be introduced to Buddhist gifts. Now, I'm a little funny about it because I love the forms. I think the forms are an integral part of the teaching. You hear me harp on posture all the time and mudra. And I chant often. I do these Japanese chants, one or two in English. I do them in Japanese. It doesn't bother me at all. I know roughly what I'm saying. But as a Jew, if I sing the Kaddish in Hebrew, I don't exactly know what I'm saying, but I know the feeling and I know I'm honoring the dead. So if you think about a ceremony as a feeling or an idea made real, made physical, when I do these ceremonies, I do them as I learned them. And there are a lot of people that felt that Catholicism took a wrong turn when it translated the Mass from Latin to English, because it's easy to get hung up in the English. The Japanese chants I do are not exactly Japanese. They are Japanese transliterations of Sanskrit and Pali, and they might not have known everything they were saying. But there's something about being in line with this tradition, and a drum and a rattle and kanji, zaibo, satsugo, jin, hanya, and it makes me feel like I'm in a long continuum. So I like haparis. I like my rakusu. Every once in a while, if I'm doing a wedding or a funeral, I'll wear an okesa. But usually I just wear a kind of polyester black robe that I can put over a suit and tie, and then my rakusu. It's light, it's easy to travel, it doesn't wrinkle. So I think that the middle is a moving decimal point, and I think that a lot of people are trying to find this American expression. The people over at Spirit Rock, all they do is they train teachers, and they're not really interested in anything ceremonial whatsoever. And that's one way of practicing. But I actually like ceremonies, and I find that they change people. Just think about a wedding. It's just a ceremony. It's a ceremony that's witnessed by people, vows that are taken in front of witnesses, because it's actually a merger of two different lineages and families and two different communities. And so that ceremony marks a point. I didn't become a priest the day that I was ordained. But about 6 months into it, I began to feel, oh yeah, I have different responsibilities here. I have to dig deeper. Same thing with transmission. So I think that in anything that involves human beings and long periods of time, religious traditions are very conservative. It takes a long time to change the direction of the Queen Mary. And I would say it's worthwhile to be patient. It's worthwhile not to be too radical. I mean, I practiced for 40 years before I began making little changes. And they're not radical, but I'm trying to find an authentic American expression. So I hope that answers your question. Here's a couple others. Oh, yeah. I'm relatively new to meditation. I find it easier at this point to do it with eyes closed. Is that not advised? This person asked that question twice. And he had let's answer that before I answer your second part of your question. In Zen, we sit with our eyes open. We're not trying to escape the world. When you sit with your eyes closed, it tends to put undue emphasis on what's going on inside your head. So you want to be careful that you're not tricking yourself, that you're not going into your zazen with some fixed idea of a special state of mind that you're looking for. We're not looking for a special state of mind. We're looking to understand what it means to be human in this moment. And so when I shut my eyes, I hear little snatches of movie scenes. I hear weird conversation. All her life, she lived in a bottle 6 inches high. They just come and they go. You can control how awake you are in Zazen by how open your eyes are. Usually we look down at about 45 degrees and we let our eyes go out of focus. But we can see to the peripheries of our vision. Are both my hands in the screen? No, they're not. There we go. Okay. This is really bizarre. I can't find my other hand. There it is. Okay. So we want to see to the periphery of our vision without really looking at anything. And if you're not really looking at anything, you see everything. So I would advise you to keep your eyes open, but just down, not looking at anything in particular. And this is why we face the wall when we start. So there's nothing there really to engage you. Try it. See what you think about it. Question 2 says, let me see, is there anything coming in? No messenger. Okay. I'm just learning how. I still can't shut my mind off. How can I start? How does one truly meditate? Shut off the brain thinking all the time during this pandemic. How can we really shut off our brains to get renewed? Is it a bad idea to meditate or begin with the eyes closed? I think this was the same first person. It often helps me get myself into the present. Think about that sentence a minute. It also helps me get myself into the present. Are there 2 of you in there? There are not. One of you is an idea. And that's extra. You don't need it. So let's say it's a complete misunderstanding to think that your job is to shut your mind off. I said this at the very beginning, but I know a lot of you who want to go to heaven but don't want to die come in after the meditation is over. So you might not have heard this. Death will shut your mind off. And when we talk about stopping the mind, we're not talking about stopping all mental activity. The brain is a gland that generates images, thoughts, sensations, feelings. You're not going to stop it. So the fact that you're thinking about your brain as some kind of separate part of your body is evidence of the problem you're having. And this is where form comes to your aid and will rescue you. If your attention, your awareness is on your posture, the back of your neck being long, Your eyes at 45 degrees, a little downward pressure on your diaphragm, your mudra, when we see it. You've covered your entire body with your mind. It's no longer a dualism. It's one thing. And that one thing can have multiple multitasking going on. So your awareness will go from, how's my mudra doing? How's my posture doing? My eyes. Oh my God, I'm sleeping with an Eskimo. Okay, how's my toes? Are they asleep? And you just let thoughts come in, you let them go. You're not trying to stop your mind. It's a big mistake. And most people are really surprised by how busy their minds actually are. You know, you don't notice it when you're on your cell phone all the time, when you're typing emails, when you're working at a hard job. Just don't notice it because you feel like, well, I'm doing it okay, so it's okay. I'm doing these things one after another. Well, actually, you're not doing it. Your mind has its own center of gravity, its own awareness. Your body has its own awareness. And in Buddhist philosophy, what we call a human being is actually a cluster of all these awarenesses. They call them skandhas: form, feeling, impulse, sensation, consciousness. They're all held together by our life force. And when our life force is over, when we've done our last exhale, well, those things go back to source, just like little waves sinking into the ocean. So let's just stop trying to shut off our minds. Let's try to think about it as becoming intimate with your mind, becoming intimate with the mind-body thing. Not one, not two. Both and. Somebody asked me, am I a Biden man? Am I voting for Biden? I'll vote for any reasonable adult. Biden seems to be the candidate. I will vote for Biden. I'm not going to argue about who the people choose. Do you have sessions every Wednesday? Yes. Someone says, is Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind a good place to learn? Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind and Suzuki Roshi's other book, Not Always So, are just incomparably brilliant, easy, accessible understanding of the mind of a Zen master. If you want more of a how-to book, I would say Robert Aitken's book, Taking the Path of Zen, or Thich Nhat Hanh's book, What the Buddha Taught, are a good balance. But I read Suzuki Roshi all the time. Anytime I'm going to do a Dharma talk, I browse through that book and I'll find something that after 47 years just stops me in my tracks. I thought I understood it, when I was 35, and then I see it again and never gets old. He was an astounding person. But there are many great teachers. We're blessed with an abundance of good teachers in the United States. So I urge people to read around. It's not going to hurt you. There's a book called Carefree Dignity by a Tibetan named Tsoknyi, Tsoknyi. There's Reb Anderson's book, Sitting Upright. I have a list on my website under Buddhism of a number of books I'd like to recommend. There's Living by Vow by Okamura. It's fun to read around in Buddhism. There's not exactly an orthodoxy. It's a practice, and personal revelation plays a big part in it, but revelation that's been shaped by practice and thought and teaching. So they're not just wild cards. Say something, if you can, about healing family relationships. Gee, why not ask me a hard question? So Suzuki Roshi once was looking down at his students, and they were sitting on thin bamboo mats. You've seen them. You can roll them up like some kind of woven grass, woven mats. And he saw one student trying to spread a wrinkle out. And when he was pushing the wrinkle toward the guy sitting on the other side. And he said, that's what war is. War is pushing your wrinkle toward someone else. And then he's pushing his wrinkle back at you. So, painful family relationships. Everything comes from something that happened before. Trees come from acorns, flowers come from seeds, birds come from eggs, eggs come from birds. The way humans feel and think come from their experiences, and maybe lifetimes of experience. So, there's a wonderful school called the Hoffman, I think it's called the Hoffman Trinity process. And when you go to it, it's about a week long, and you fill out these 80-page forms about all your relationships with your parents and caregivers and things like that, positives and negatives. And for about the first 3 days, they give you ball bats and they monitor you, and you just beat the crap out of these big stuffed cushions. I mean, until your muscles are exhausted, till you cannot do it anymore. And you are expressing this anger, this hatred, this disappointment that's been locked in your muscles. Then the next 3 days, you take the part of your parents or caregivers or foster people, and you look at them and you understand what their experiences were, how they got made that way, what their traumas were. And then the final couple days, you integrate the two of them. So, family relationships well, you have to begin with what can you control. So the only thing that you can actively work on is understanding and accepting your own anger, disappointment, sorrow, grief, what have you. That's what's available to you. And when you can talk about it without undue emotion that will spin other people off, well, of course, you can communicate it. But sometimes you don't get a receptive audience. Sometimes you have to take the love that you would like to give to someone else, and it's unacceptable. They can't accept it. So you have to give it to someone else. But the beginning of healing begins with understanding your contribution. I had a rough dad as a kid, very violent, very dangerous, really interesting man, not a real good father, very driven, very consumed. And he would do things, and I would get angry, I would get disappointed, or embittered, and then I would do something in response as, a 6 or 7 or 10-year-old. But when I got older, I realized, if I'd been wise, I could have started owning my own feelings and looking at them, trying to understand whether or not my father's actions to me were really personal, or was he corresponding to ghosts from his own life. My father's father killed his horse with a hammer in front of him. That's the house that he grew up in. My father walked the halls of our house with a pistol for the first year after I was born, because we lived in the town where Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped and killed. So he lived in a world of great violence and great threat and great fear. And his love for me led him to believe that the best thing he could do for me was toughen me up and teach me to see the world the way he saw it. But I was not him. I was a different kind of person. So that created a lot of problems amongst us. And I had a therapist once tell me, he said, you don't have to forgive your parents when they do things that are unconscionable or really bad. You don't have to forgive them. But it's up to you whether or not you choose to be angry. So each of you that are responding to this or listening to me talk, you have your own dynamic in mind. Some of you maybe were very young, some of you were older, so I can't address them all. But I'll tell you something that was sort of the icing on the cake in my coming to terms with my dad and the problems engendered there. And I'm not suggesting it was easy. It took me 12 years of heroin and 2 books, and then this that I'm going to describe now. The psychiatrist told me to write a letter and put everything down in it. And my father was dead by this time. So I did. I wrote a 15-page letter. And I read it to him, and he said, yeah, that sounds like everything. Okay, here's your homework. Take that letter, put it in a drawer, and every month take it out and read it. And when you can read it and no emotion gets aroused, then you can burn it. So I did that. It took me 18 months. But by the end of it, I had sort of exhausted that narrative. Now, I'm sure some of you would like to solve problems while your parents are living. Or maybe you're living together, or maybe you're living with a husband or a wife where there's communication blocks. Again, the very first thing you can understand, you know what you want, and you know what you think you need. But how are you expressing it? And how important are those wants? And how important are those needs? I know when we fight with someone, we tend to be absolute. And we tend to hold all the goodness, and we tend to put all the badness out on them. It's like we're not owning the part of our nature that we put on our mate. So a pretty useful exercise is to take every judgment that we'd make about the person that we're at odds with and say, how do I do this? Under what circumstances, under what conditions do I do this? And when you start to see the ways in which you're alike, it changes things just a little bit. And it makes it easier to talk without judgment. Because the first thing people respond to is judgment. If I feel a judgment coming at me, I automatically armor myself. Well, not so much anymore, because I know I'm an empty pipe, so I can let it blow through. But without that knowledge, yeah, we armor ourselves and we stop listening. We start waiting for our turn and waiting for the speaking to stop. So I don't know another way to do this other than by working on yourself. And if you work on yourself and you can chill the climate, you might be able to convince somebody to go to counseling, to get a referee to help you both. You might find the other person's listening. You might ask yourself, am I imposing statutes of limitations? How long am I going to stay angry about this? I can't give you specific because it's a general question. But I can tell you that you're a part of it. You're contributing, even if you feel like you're a victim. You're contributing. You have an idea of yourself. You have an idea of your power. You have an idea of your weakness. You have an idea of how you're being abused. And it's useful to remember that there's nobody home. that the thing you call you is a moving target. It's awareness. And I find that to be really helpful. That there's nothing solid that's being permanently scarred. And that when I can drop my habits and look at my predilections with irony, a little humor, I have a lot bigger field to run around in. Let me see if we got any messages. Let's see, what's this? Somebody's asking what order I'm with. I don't know. My training is as a Zen priest. So Zen is a sect of Mahayana Buddhism. Would be nice to just be and not have an order to just be. It's not exactly a question, but my question would be, well, who's ordering you? Who's ordering and who's listening? Can you show me both? If you can't, just be. You can't help it. Sometimes it seems like the goal of Zen or a teacher, and also to become enlightened. Can one simply develop a meditation practice and attend meetings like this in the same manner as a person who attends a Christian church on Sunday for community? I think so. I've said before that enlightenment is kind of overdone. A student asked Suzuki Roshi about enlightenment, and he said, "You may not like it." The Dalai Lama says, "My religion is simple. It's kindness." Obviously, some intuition brings you to come to these meetings, and some feeling, some intuition about the universe. That's how I came to Buddhism, because I found it described the universe better than anything else I had ever heard. And I found that the people who were drawn to it tended to be kind and less aggressive and less, narcissistic. I'd say any way you want to practice is okay. The thing about enlightenment is it's not separate from the way you practice. Enlightenment is not a fence that you, oops, I touched my computer. Enlightenment is not a fence that you jump over and you're on the other side of it. Enlightenment is seeing the world as it is, and you can't stay there. You can't stay in that state. But when you come back from it, you see constant reminders everywhere. There's a Suzuki Roshi talks about seeing a sliver of the moon behind clouds. And when you see the sliver of the moon, you sense the fullness of the moon, even though you can't see it. Well, when you've had an experience of the self falling away, everything you see is like the sliver of the moon, reminds you of the unseen wholeness of it. So I don't think it's a good idea to have that as a goal, although that's what brought me to Zen practice. I wanted to be enlightened. I wanted to know the answer to everything. I wanted to be the boss of everything. Gets old. Just come, just sit, be with people you like. Don't worry about being enlightened. Worry about being kind. Worrying about taking care of every part of the world that you touch. Let's see, anything else? Okay, here's some more questions. Somebody's agreeing with me. I like those, but I won't read them. Several talks back, you said suffering is wanting everything to be different. Please talk about doing political work in this context. So when in one of the first lectures I was talking, how are we doing? I was talking about dukkha and saying dukkha is like all the mental activity of thinking. We want to hold on to pleasant situations. We want to get rid of unpleasant situations. We don't like the way we feel now. We want to change it. So how is that consistent with political change? A lot of people apply to political change in the same way they apply to their own suffering. If you recognize that nothing's going away, political change is never going to get rid of ignorance. It's never going to get rid of envy. It's never going to get rid of competition. It's never going to get rid of any of those qualities which you possess, just like the people you're opposing. So when we see something that's wrong, as Buddhists, we just mark it. We usually do it by sitting, say meditating outside a nuclear processing center. We don't shout. We don't make enemies of the people that are inside doing that work for motives that we don't understand. We are just expressing the Buddha's edicts: kindness, compassion, mutual dependence, dependent origination. So in this moment, for instance, when Black Lives Matter is gaining the currency that it should have had for centuries, when we show up in a demonstration, we don't have to make enemies. We're just showing up and expressing what we want. We don't have to expect that human beings are going to change, but we can change the climate where they won't feel comfortable, let's say, about expressing racist views. You can't force someone to love a person of another kind or culture. And it's also useful to remember that we have our own prejudices. We hate people who hate black people. We hate Donald Trump for being a racist or a misogynist. We hate Harvey Weinstein for raping and assaulting women. I'm not saying it's all the same, but I'm saying we need to recognize the impulse, and that those people who are expressing certain impulses, they're humans just like we are. And when we can drop the judgment and listen to them without judgment, they might listen to us. And we might have the beginning of a relationship. And if we think that that relationship could take 400 years to bear fruit, we'll be less impatient. So I think you always have to express your values and what you stand for. But the anger is extra. The shouting is extra. If you remember the civil rights, you're probably too young, but the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, black people dressed like they were going to church. And the only time they raised their voices was to sing. And it made the line between themselves and the people beating them and spitting on them and setting dogs and fire hoses on them indivisibly clear. You had to take a side. And that side moved the needle a little bit, created the Civil Rights Bill, created an end to segregation. But nothing stands still. For many years, the southern states were under federal supervision. They were not allowed to change any voting criteria or procedures without permission from the federal government. And a few years ago, the federal government removed that. And they immediately began suppressing the vote. So combating ignorance with wisdom is ongoing. And one of the reasons we sit is to get the strength and the courage and the endurance to just keep going and modeling the behavior so that others will see it and model our behavior. And in that way, it keeps going across generations. I'll take, I think, one more question because it's getting late. So I don't know whether this is a criticism of me or not, but I'm going to read it because it's interesting. In Zen, there must be enlightenment. There must be a general mental upheaval which destroys the old accumulations of intellection and lays down the foundation for a new life. There must be the awakening of a new sense which will review the old things from a hitherto undreamed of angle of observation. But nothing awakens religious consciousness like suffering. I don't know who told you all that. How do you know? In Zen, there must be enlightenment. Everyone's enlightened. They just don't know it. Zen didn't invent enlightenment. Buddha didn't invent enlightenment. Enlightenment is the natural state of human beings when we clear away greed, hatred, delusion, bad practices, indulgences. Enlightenment is not other than human beings. It's not other than this culture. There must be a general mental upheaval which destroys the old accumulations of intellection. Are you suggesting that if you have an awakening, you forget everything that you've ever learned? That all your life experience up to that point is just forgotten and useless? I don't know anyone that's like that. I mean, there is a constant refreshment by being always in the present moment. But there's a tone to this question. There's a tone of didacticism and like, this is coming down. Moses handing this down to the rest of us. So my first question would be, have you had this experience? And if you haven't had this experience, why are you so didactic about it? Maybe this is the way you imagine enlightenment. But I can guarantee something, that if you have an awakening, it will be unlike anything you could have ever possibly imagined. And you might not like it. All right, one more. Buddha attained enlightenment. Does that mean nirvana is a permanent state and therefore differs from satori, which hits suddenly only to eventually subside into memory? Fundamental rule of the universe, according to Buddha, is everything changes. You can't hold on to enlightenment. Satori, enlightenment, nirvana. Do your best. A Zen master who's not paying attention is no different than anyone else who's not paying attention. Do your best. If you happen to have an awakening, experience it fully. Don't try to hold on to it.